Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Right. So I'm just going to run through these reforms. We've done 2 of them already, both of which required, well, not required, but needed a long campaign before anything was done. So both controversial. The first we've done in some detail, the emancipation of the Caribbean slaves. Finally, the slaves were given their freedom, but because of the situation in the government, there was a weak government. Many of them had slaving interests. They're all being discovered now, of course, all the stately homes that were built using money from slavery. The slaves weren't given total freedom. They had to work for 7 years as it was called being an apprentice, which was a weasel word, meaning you carried on working for nothing. But gradually they were paid, but that meant that they had to pay for their own accommodation and their own food, which they hadn't had to do before. So it wasn't all wine and roses, it wasn't all wonderful, and they were never compensated. The black slaves were never compensated for what had happened to them, that many of them had been stolen from Africa. But the slave owners were compensated £37 per slave, which was a lot of money in those days. So that was undoubtedly a reform. Everybody accepted that that was a reform, but it wasn't quite as generous as it should have been. Martin's found a very good passage to sort of illustrate that. Then Althorpe's Factory Act. Althorpe was the Home Secretary, and he was a Spencer. Lord Althorpe was the name of the heir to the Spencer estates, and he's a distant relative of Princess Diana, who, as you know, was a Spencer, a great Whig family. Althorpe's Factory Act followed a long campaign, and again, it was a reform, it was an improvement, but again, it was limited because of all the rich people, all the factory owners and the mill owners who put up a very vigorous campaign saying, "Leave us alone. This is supposed to be a free country. Why is Parliament interfering in the way we make money?" So there was a rather like today, it was a political and also a social issue. But the Whigs finally gave way, and it's called Althorpe's Factory Act because he was the Home Secretary. No child workers under the age of 9. The problem with the problem with that was, how are you going to prove how old they were? Because they didn't have birth certificates in those days. So there's a lot of cheating. If a child was well grown, they would say he was 9, and they would teach the child to say he was 9 or she. Somebody asks you, if the nice man with the posh voice asks you how old you are, you say you're 9. And of course they did. So that was one loophole in the law. There were various other loopholes about not working certain times and not working at night. It was an easy act to disobey. So the Factory Act was a step forward. It was certainly a reform. The great thing about that Factory Act was that they appointed inspectors. There'd been previous Factory Acts which had not worked at all because they hadn't appointed any inspectors, and so the factory owners just went back to their bad old ways, knowing that nobody would find out. They would just disobey the law, and nobody would contact them and get them into any kind of trouble. So this was definitely a step forward, but a limited step forward, and this is what the candidates that were doing exams had to do. how reforming were these reforms? How good were they? Did they do what they were supposed to do? They certainly didn't stop children working in mills. The next reform.
Just before we go there, Judy, your video's dropped out again, Martin. If you could just reset.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep, you're back in.
Right, thank you, Jonathan. The next great reform certainly has a very dubious reputation. The Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834, very controversial at the time and ever since. Again, it was to please the middle classes who were totally fed up of paying their parish rates for people that they thought were not worthy of help. The poor. There was a growing belief that if you were poor, it was somehow your fault. You should be able to get a job. If there wasn't one locally, then you should walk, or many public transport in those days, would hitch a lift on a wagon and find work. There was work to be had. There was also a belief that the working classes were totally irresponsible, and that if they got some money, they went straight off to the ale house and drank the money away. The reason for that, the reason that people did go to the ale house, it has to be admitted that they did, was that their homes were so crowded. If they got a big family and a very small cottage, they would go home after a hard day's work in the fields, assuming that they were farm labourers. They'd go home back to their house, and sometimes there was no fire and lots of crying children and no comfort, just hard chairs. The ale house was very attractive. It was well lighted, and there was company there, and the seats were all comfortable, and the ale was attractive to sort of wash away all the dust of the day. Of course they went to the ale house. The middle class people were drinking their heads off. So this is a mean-spirited sort of attitude. Oh, they'll just spend it on drink. Or they deliberately had big families because they were paid poor law allowance according to how many children they got. So they just went on, the argument was, well, they just keep on having children. So we tell them what's causing it and stop them. So there were all sorts of mean-spirited beliefs about the labouring classes. They weren't called working class, the labouring classes. Factory hands, the same, they're irresponsible. So in a way, why should we help them? Why should we help them? They are unlikely to get work if we are giving them handouts every week. There's no incentive to find work. We're making life too comfortable for them. And the old poor law system was very out of date and no longer fit for purpose. It had been established in 1601, the last few years of Queen Elizabeth's reign, and it had worked well then, but it no longer worked well. There were many, many complaints about how much money the middle classes were having to hand out to irresponsible, stupid working class people. Who were not really trying to find work. Most of this was untrue, but the middle classes very rarely mixed or mingled with anybody from the labouring classes, so they just assumed that these people were lazy and irresponsible. So the system needed to be overhauled. Lot of discussion about how what form this would take, and eventually, of course, it was decided that the system needed to be brought up to date and money must be saved so that the poor law rates didn't fall or so heavily on the middle classes. They were the ones who were paying the poor law rates because it had originally been sorted out in parishes. So parish relief, it was called. You went to the parish and got money, a handout. If they didn't give you money, if you were poor, if you didn't have money, they would give you outdoor relief, it was called. It might be money, but more likely it was food and clothing, and sometimes fuel for your fire. It was a bit like a food parcel today, or a food bank. People preferred money, of course, but much of the relief was in kind. Meant that it was, as I said, clothing, nappies for a new baby, that sort of thing. So the change was outdoor relief totally discontinued. That was very dramatic. No more outdoor relief. No more staying in your cottage and having money every week or goods delivered every week. Local parishes were grouped into poor law unions. There were 600 locally elected boards of guardians. That was good. Each union had to provide a workhouse for those in dire need. And there's a lot of discussion in the House of Commons regarding dire need. What did it mean exactly, dire need? How needy did you have to be to prove that you needed a place in the workhouse? In the workhouse, the work was very, very degrading, deliberately, either smelly or just hard to do and repetitive. It was meant to be a deterrent, to encourage people to not go to the workhouse, to try in every possible way to get paid employment, driving people to try harder than they had done before. The belief was that people don't say, we're just sitting at home, being totally irresponsible, going to the alehouse every night, living off the parish. It wasn't really true, but that was what the middle classes thought. Uniforms had to be worn. If you went to the workhouse, you wore a uniform to identify you. That was humiliating for adults. You were separated once you went to the workhouse. If it was a husband and wife, the husband and wife were separated. There was a block in the workhouse for the men, and another block for the women, and another block for children, or possibly two blocks for very small children and then older children. That was all part of the idea of deterrence, but also the idea that if they were separated, they couldn't have any more children, because it was an issue. They're having children so that they can get more money. So that's why they were separated. And that was a huge issue that was debated in the House of Commons. In the marriage vows, it's until death us do part, and that a couple should be allowed to live together because they've taken the marriage vows. But the main argument was, well, we're keeping them apart so they won't have any more children. So that's how strongly the middle classes felt about the poor law, about dishing out money to people who were unworthy of the money. So the idea was to make the workhouses uninviting. The food was repetitive. It was not, obviously, there was enough of it to stop people from starving, but it was very simple and it was very repetitive. And people would therefore only enter the workhouse if they were in absolute despair. They reached rock bottom, they tried everything, and they tried asking relatives for help. They'd done everything they possibly could, and they were starving. So they would then apply to the workhouse, it was called. They would go to the workhouse and tell their story and be given a place. Very quickly, these places were called bastilles. They were regarded as prisons, especially because of the uniform and the horrible work that people had to do. One example, breaking stones into different sizes for roads. So giving somebody a boulder and they had to turn it into gravel. Another job they did was bones would be delivered to them from butchers, lots and lots of bones, and they had to split the bones, get the marrow out, and then grind the bones up for bone meal, for fertilizer, which had been discovered, a kind of magic thing to put on your fields and your crops would increase. So workhouses were quite useful for that, actually producing the bone meal. Incredibly dirty job and horribly smelly, because the marrow had gone bad inside the bones. So that was an extremely unpleasant task. Making ropes for the Navy, very hard on your hands. The first few weeks, your hands would be torn to pieces because the ropes were made of such coarse stuff. So that was another thing they did, making ropes of different sizes, different widths. But the very big ropes, the horses, were really, really hard to do, and that job was given to people in workhouses. So horrible conditions, separated from your family, boring food, nasty work. I think Jonathan's going to say something. No, he isn't. Shaking his head. Right, Jonathan isn't going to say anything. So I'm sure we all know about Oliver Twist. And interestingly, that book was written only 4 years after the workhouses were opened, because it took a year or two to build the workhouses. Our nearest one is Aston, the big workhouse at Aston. That was the Union workhouse. They had to be big because they were covering many parishes. And Dickens had found out about the workhouses and how dreadful they, well, not all dreadful, but pretty dreadful, and how people dreaded going into them, which was the whole idea. That meant the scheme was working. This reform was working. People didn't want to go into the workhouse. They were doing any kind of work rather than have to admit failure and go and apply for a place. But he wrote his book, Oliver Twist, about a poor child that was actually born in the workhouse and what that was like, and asking for more food. I mean, he made it almost like a comedy at times, and had characters that are, well, typically Dickensian, slightly larger than life. But he was actually raising a serious issue. Was it fair to treat the children like that? They haven't failed in any way. The poor things are actually born in the workhouse. So he was revealing how heartless the system was, and it was widely criticised from the word go. Gradually relaxed, but this fear of the workhouse continued for many, many years, and I think certainly our grandparents were afraid of the workhouse. They're afraid of situations becoming so out of hand that they lost all hope, and they dreaded going to the workhouse. But it was a reform. If you're thinking of saving money, well then yes, it did. The parish rates fell quite dramatically. Then the Municipal Corporations Act 1835, not really very exciting, but a way of modernising local government, giving local government better organisation and national uniformity. So that's a modern thing to do, to try and create uniformity so that everywhere is the same. Municipal boroughs governed by town councils elected by ratepayers. Again, the idea that it would be democratic, elected by ratepayers. And women were allowed to vote. So that's a big step forward. Two other places, Manchester and Birmingham, growing very rapidly, turning into cities rather than towns, had only had medieval systems of local government. Lord of the Manor. Birmingham had a Lord of the Manor, and he was in charge. Quite incredible to think about that. 1838, before Birmingham was recognised as leading modern local government. Then, commutation of tithes. Tithes, as you know, means tenth. It's a biblical concept. It comes from the Old Testament. That the Hebrews, the Jews, are told to give a tenth of their goods back to God as a thank offering. And tithe is the old word for tenth, sort of a Saxon word. And this had continued for generations and generations, that you gave a tenth, usually again in kind. There's a famous picture of a famous cartoon picture of a lady, not in rags exactly, but not looking too well off. And there's the rector, it turns out, the rector is standing there and he's taking a piglet. And there are all the other piglets, and he's taking a tenth of the piglet, which is the sows have 10 piglets, so he's taking one as of right. And the lady's saying, I've got 10 children, would you like one of they? The tithe system was incredibly unpopular, as you can imagine. Poor people struggling to make ends meet, and along comes the vicar or the rector, or they might call him the priest, it was Anglican anyway, and marched off with a tenth of their harvest. Quite hard-hearted, really, when people were struggling to feed their families. It gave the church a very bad reputation for being sort of greedy, heartless, unfeeling, etc., etc. But the church had kind of hung on to this right. It was a right. They didn't want to give it up. But by 1836, there were so many protests about it. It was so unpopular that it was commuted to. It wasn't taken away completely. This again was quite a cautious, tiptoeing kind of act. The money it would be paid in money rather than kind. So rector couldn't come and grab one of the piglets as a right, but lady would have to, or husband would have to pay money, but it was only a small amount. And even so, you think of it, while they were dealing with this problem, they would abolish the tithes altogether. So, like most of the Whig reforms, cautious. Then a very, very useful act, births, deaths and marriages. Registration Act, 1836. Another act modernising and bringing up to date a traditional system. The traditional system was that, yes, there were records of births. Well, no, not of births, they were of christenings. Babies were supposed to be christened 8 days after they were born. So you could work out when the child was born from the christening certificate or baptismal certificate. Marriages were recorded and deaths were recorded, but they were kept by the parish. There was a parish recorder, a sort of secretary that had nice handwriting, copper plate, and he would, it was always a man, he would record in a book, a large book, probably the same book, he would record all these things that had happened in the parish. Unfortunately, that wasn't a very effective way of keeping records. Those of you who've traced your family tree probably know that. You might get very excited that you found a book with some records in, but it's very damaged. The problem was not all parish clerks were competent. Sometimes they couldn't read. That's interesting. They could write. Somebody taught them to write beautifully, but they couldn't actually read. So they wrote things wrong. They needed them to be accurate because people were making claims for property according to, did the marriage actually take place, or were the children illegitimate, in which case they couldn't inherit goods and chattels. So these parish records were liable to be damaged. They could be damaged by fire, because open candles were used in churches and there were quite a few fires. only small ones, and the fire would be put out. But you know, if the vestry was on fire, then maybe the parish records would be destroyed. Damp, a serious problem, and bookworms munching away at the parish records, because that's what bookworms do. And if they weren't infested, if they weren't checked regularly, they could do a huge amount of damage before the next ceremony took place. And so they opened the book, and yeah, they had been munching away at the book. So often these parish records were badly stored. Mice were a problem, and other vermin, rats sometimes. Very, very hungry mice would sometimes smell the leather on the back of a book, and then they would attack the book itself. So that was the situation, that people that needed to investigate, for example, whether a marriage had taken place, or whether a child had died and the next child had been given the same name. You know, could that child inherit? All sorts of things that people needed to know. And it was a messy system, and just not fit for purpose, basically. So the new arrangement was that births would be recorded, not just baptisms, because not all children were baptized. So births had to be recorded as now, registered. I don't know what the new arrangement is, how soon I think it's a few weeks you have, when you've had a baby, you have to register it within a certain time. And I'm not sure what that time is. But the same thing happened in 1836. You've got to register your child's birth. If you couldn't do it, then the midwife or the doctor would do it, because it was very important that the child was registered. Similarly, deaths and marriages were recorded locally in the parish church, but they were then, copies of the certificates would be kept centrally in London. So that was a big move forward. Dissenters' Marriage Act, which went along with births, deaths and marriages. Dissenters allowed nonconformists to be married in a civil ceremony instead of forcing them to be married in an Anglican church. It broke the monopoly of the Anglican church. Also, nonconformists could take degrees at what's called then London University. It was called the Godless College. This broke the monopoly of Oxford and Cambridge, where if you were not an Anglican, you could not graduate, because you had to take promises which were written by the Church of England, and you had to be you had to take communion, you had to be kind of an official member of the Anglican community. They didn't accept nonconformists. So this was another step forward and very welcome, stopping the stranglehold that the Anglican Church had rather like the Tides. They had been very dominant, and they stopped anybody that wasn't an Anglican from graduating, because you had to take an oath, a promise on the oath of a Christian gentleman. Similarly, you couldn't be an MP unless you were an Anglican, because you had to take, sorry, if you were not a Christian, if you were not a Christian. This only applied at the time to Jews. So we're going forward a bit in time, but Disraeli, who was Jewish, but had become an Anglican, become Christian, but was still Jewish, he fought very hard for this reform to take place, because it was discriminatory, that you took your oath to be an MP on the oath of a Christian gentleman. Now, why does it have to be Christian? Well, because it went back years and years and years. It was traditional. And eventually in the 1850s, that barrier was removed. The first MP that took the new oath, which didn't include the word Christian, was Lord Rothschild. And he, of course, because he was fabulously wealthy, had clout, more than Disraeli did at that time, more than Disraeli did. But gradually what's happening is that the barriers are falling, the old traditional barriers, and this government had gone some way towards modernising and bringing statutes up to date. There were other reforms, but that means into Victoria's reign, because the Whigs stayed in power until 1841. So, looking at the final years of King William. Now, his popularity rose and fell according to the national mood. As we found already, he could become very unpopular and have stones thrown at his carriage. I mean, imagine that today. You know, the Queen bowling along in one of her state coaches and people throwing stones. But that's because the time we're talking about, people were reacting in a very violent way. It was a time of really quite unpredictable behaviour on the part of the public, the mob, particularly the mob in London. And people have done a lot of research on this topic. First of all, what constituted a mob? Why were they angry? Why did they seem to be available at all times? Why did they throw things? Why were they so worked up about whatever it was that they were throwing stones at the royal family? And it's a very interesting topic, because this kind of mob culture almost came from nowhere. It started in the 18th century, and by the 19th century it was becoming influential. You know, the mob was beginning to have political power and influence. People were afraid of these mobs sort of joining together, all these people joining together. They had power. Not only political power, but just the very fact that the numbers and the fact that they were so angry. So during the Reform Bill contest, the mob particularly disliked Queen Adelaide, because they believed, and they were right, that she was very, very frightened of public demonstrations, remembering things that had happened in Mindingham when she was little. She hated the idea of a mob because she felt that they were so powerful. It often meant, in her experience, change of government, that they would take over. They would be almost like a coup d'etat. So during that period, they were unpopular. And then when the king gave in and said he would create Whig peers to overbalance the Tory majority in the House of Lords, the mob kind of swung round within hours and became very, very partial to the king, and he became popular again. The Queen never so much, because she was foreign anyway, and we didn't like foreigners. So, poor Queen Adelaide, who, bless her, was a wonderful woman in many ways. She gave huge amounts of money to charities. She set charities up. She was the kindest soul, but she got the blame for, well, anything really. You know, she became a kind of scapegoat. Popularity plummeted again when Lord Grey retired in 1834. Lord Melbourne, who I think we all remember as kind of mentor to Queen Victoria, we even talk of her marrying him. They were so close. Lord Melbourne replaced Lord Grey as Prime Minister, and there was a situation where the King, William IV, couldn't stand Lord Melbourne. There were lots of people he couldn't stand. And he's quite open about it, which he shouldn't have been. As a constitutional monarch, he shouldn't have been so open in his dislike of certain people and his liking of other people. Anyway, he suddenly sacked Lord Melbourne out of the blue and demanded that the Tories have a go. Tories come into power under Peel, Robert Peel. So this was kind of unconstitutional. It wasn't against the law exactly, but it was unconstitutionally. It was unconstitutional. The king, well, the monarch wasn't supposed to interfere like that after the election. He's supposed to keep the government that the people have chosen. Again, public outcry, stones being thrown at the royal carriage, hissing. You don't hear hissing anymore, but it was quite popular. A lot of people all hissing, which apparently was quite intimidating for the person being hissed at. The minority government could hardly struggle on, and Melbourne took over again, and once more popularity of King restored. Now, he started to go quite peculiar in old age. He'd always been, the word often used about him was odd. Odd. An odd person. He always went a bit funny in the spring. April was usually a bad month for the king because he became even odder in April. And people close to him, particularly his wife, Queen Adelaide, spent their time nervously wondering what he was going to say next. He expressed annoyance quite openly. For example, this is the day she arrived, that's the Duchess of Kent, the King prorogued Parliament, and Melbourne noticed that he was in a difficult mood. He disliked the Speaker, and all the time that worthy House of Commons Speaker was addressing him, he observed repeatedly to Melbourne, shocking voice he has. And he expressed himself loudly and sometimes quite crudely. He used the word damn a lot, which to us is quite mild, but in those days wasn't appropriate, certainly for the king. And he used that word a lot, damn somebody or damn something. So that was inappropriate behaviour. But one big issue was his health was failing, so we can forgive a little bit of bad temper. Failing health, he had asthma, he had heart trouble, he had gout in his hands, and failing mobility, became increasingly eccentric and irascible. Held very inflexible views. For example, he hated Buckingham Palace, which is now complete. He said he was never going to live in it. And when the House of Commons burned down, you probably remember this massive fire, he suggested that Buckingham Palace would make a good alternative. Instead of rebuilding Parliament, which was the choice, eventually, we rebuild, he suggested using Buckingham Palace. He didn't like pomp and ceremony. He didn't want to live in Buckingham Palace. He was persuaded to, but he didn't like it at all and kept on saying he didn't like it. But he particularly disliked, or could say hated, his sister-in-law, the Duchess of Kent, Princess Victoria's mother, the heir to the throne. So we'll come on to that. The king continued, despite his ill health, to hold huge parties, dinner parties for his naval friends and their women, their wives. And he continued to act with great generosity to anyone he found in need, especially ex-servicemen. He set up many charities, and he's not thanked for that. It's something people don't know about, but he particularly naval charities, but the forces generally. He was determined that veterans weren't going to be begging in the streets, which they had done after Waterloo. Actually begging because they hadn't got any income. Sometimes they'd had a leg shot away, got a wooden leg. They found work, getting paid work really difficult, and they were reduced to begging. Portsmouth full of ex-naval men begging in the streets. He was determined that wasn't going to happen when he was king. So this is an example of how embarrassing he could be. It says, through the celebration of the king, this is Greville, who was the kind of correspondent, we call him today, a parliamentary correspondent, wrote very clearly, but in a spiteful sort of way. Greville was famous for being rather vindictive. Though the celebration of the king's birthday was what was called private, said Greville, there were 100 people at dinner. That's typically the king. He was so generous. He was always about inviting people to the dinner. It was a nightmare for the people actually cooking the food. The Duchess of Kent sat on one side of the king and one of his sisters on the other, the Princess Victoria opposite. After dinner, by the Queen's desire, His Majesty's health and long life to him was given, and as soon as it was drunk, he made a very long speech, in the course of which he poured forth the following extraordinary and foudroyant tirade. I don't know what that means, but anyway, this is what he said. Rebel was scribbling away. I trust in God that my life may be spared for 9 months longer, after which period, in the event of my death, no regency would take place. That's because the princess would reach the age of 18, and for royalty, that meant coming of age. I should then have the satisfaction of leaving the royal authority to the personal exercise of that young lady, pointing to the princess, the heiress of the crown, and not in the hands of a person now near me, who is herself incompetent to act with propriety in the station in which she would be placed. I have no hesitation in saying that I have been insulted, grossly and continually insulted by that person, but I'm determined to endure no longer a course of behaviour so disrespectful to me. I would have her know that I am king, and I am determined to make my authority respected. This awful Philippic speech was uttered with a loud voice and in an excited manner. The Queen looked in deep distress, the princess burst into tears, and the whole company were aghast. Well, you can imagine, this is the lady who, if William didn't make it for the next few weeks, and he was very ill, she would become the regent on behalf of her daughter. It says, after this speech, the Duchess of Kent not unnaturally ordered her carriage, and only with difficulty was the Queen able to persuade her to remain at the castle until the following morning. The shopping exhibition marred the remaining year of William's life, and he made matters worse by refusing to apologise to his sister-in-law for the public insult. Queen Adelaide was exceedingly unhappy and ashamed. She tried so hard to remain friends with the Duchess and prevent the King from quarrelling with her. And although each of these visits of the Princess Victoria must have awakened the pain that lay hidden in her child-loving heart, remember, all Adelaide's children had died, she appeared not to know the meaning of jealousy and was always kindness personified to both of them. Maria Louisa Victoria, that's the Duchess of Kent, however, seemed anxious only to press her advantage as mother of the future Queen and to do everything in her power, not only to infuriate the King, but to hurt and humiliate her sister-in-law. So that was the situation in the last few months of William's reign. Then he said he rather embarrassed some church dignitaries, but this wasn't as bad, by giving them a banquet in which he informed them quite simply, when I was a young man, I believed in nothing but pleasure and folly, nothing at all. But when I went to sea, got into a gale, and saw the wonders of the mighty deep, then I believed, and I have been a sincere Christian ever since. Well, that's lovely, isn't it? So open and honest, and admitting what he was like when he was a young man, all pleasure and folly, and then becoming a Christian. So what a strange mixture. First of all, he wouldn't take his medicine. Then he decided that he would. He was very reluctant to go to bed. He didn't want to admit that he was very weak and could hardly hold a pen, was having breathing problems because of his heart. His heart was giving up. So by June the 12th, it was known for the first time that the King was alarmingly ill. But although he was only kept alive with raw meat and curacoa, he refused to allow any bulletins to be issued, saying that as long as he was able to transact public business, he would not have the public alarmed on his account. generous spirited. During the week, he received the Hanoverian minister and the Duke of Cumberland, who would soon become King of Hanover. The end was so near now that former animosities seemed to fade away. On the 16th, he observed to the Queen, "I have had some quiet sleep. Come and pray with me and thank the Almighty for it." On the following Sunday, he remarked, "This is the 18th of June. I would like to live to see the sun of Waterloo set." And when Lord Munster, that's one of his illegitimate children, knowing with what enthusiasm his father had always celebrated Waterloo Day, brought him the flag, which his old friend, the Iron Duke, the Duke of Wellington, sent annually. The old king grasped the fold and said, "Ah, that was a glorious day for England." Later in the day, together with the Queen and his daughter, Lady Mary Fox, another of his illegitimate children, he received the sacrament from the Archbishop with attention and great apparent comfort, and his last royal act was to pardon a condemned man. But still he refused to go to bed, and on the next day he sat in his chair with the Queen kneeling by his side, turning over the pages of his huge prayer book, while the Archbishop read the Visitation of the Sick. He held her other hand tightly the whole while, and when overcome with exhaustion, Adelaide began to cry, he remarked characteristically, "Bear up, bear up." He then saw all his children, and at the Queen's suggestion, sent a kind message to Princess Victoria. She was not invited to take leave of him, possibly because it was certain that her mother would insist upon coming with her, and her presence would not have been at all welcome to the dying king. Very early on the morning of June the 20th, Queen Adelaide sent the Bishop and Lord Cunningham on their historic mission to Kensington Palace, where the faint rays of dawn, streaming through the half-open shutters into the still, undusted drawing room, they knelt to kiss the hand of their new sovereign, Queen Victoria. The Queen said, she wrote this in her journal, he was very odd and peculiar. Sorry, very odd and singular. But his intentions were often ill-interpreted. And indeed, William IV has never been sufficiently appreciated. So we're starting one of the longest reigns in British history, remembering that Queen Victoria was only just 18 years old when she inherited the crown. The king had managed to keep going for 3 weeks after she came of age. So his wish had been granted. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Judy. Welcome.
Sorry, it really hurts. I'm like paralyzed when this happens. It goes right down to the foot.
Thank you, Judy. As you see, Judy gets set in place,
Oh,
and we need a crane to move her.
crane. Not crane. No, not a crane.
Somewhat
Okay.
harsh, somewhat harsh.
Yeah.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you, Judy. Martin, I should watch it.
We'll do it again in a fortnight's time.